Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the plantation lady who bred slaves with her own sons. A chilling secret from Georgia in 1847 that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The year is 1864. The air in Georgia hangs thick and heavy, not just with the familiar humidity of late summer, but with the metallic tang of gunpowder and the palpable tension of a nation tearing itself apart. The Civil War, a brutal crucible of ideology and iron, is in its final, convulsive stages. Through this ravaged landscape marches the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, an instrument of the Union's will, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the rust-red clay of the earth. They are not conquerors in the traditional sense. They are liberators, tasked with dismantling a world built on the bedrock of human bondage. It is during one such sweep through the desolate heart of Burke County that they come across a name that history has tried to forget, Thornhill Estate. To the soldiers, it is just another plantation. A ghost of southern aristocracy left to wither on the vine. The main house, a once grand Palladian-style manor, now sags under the weight of neglect, its white columns appealing, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over fields where cotton no longer grows. But it is not the derelict mansion that stills the soldiers in their tracks. It is a sound, a faint but persistent hum that seems to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. It is a sound of life, but it is devoid of joy, a low, mournful chorus that speaks of confinement and sorrow. Led by a wary captain, the men trace the sound to its source, a pair of heavy iron doors, flush with the earth and almost entirely consumed by a lattice of kudzu vines. They look ancient, forgotten. It takes the combined strength of 3 battle-weary men, their shoulders straining against the oxidized metal, to wrench the doors open. A wave of cool, musty air, thick with the scent of damp earth and unwashed bodies, rushes out to meet them, a foul breath from a long-sealed tomb. As their eyes adjust to the gloom, the humming stops, replaced by a sudden, terrified silence. What they find in the suffocating darkness is a scene that will etch itself into their memories, a horror that surpasses the carnage of the battlefield. Huddled together in the far corner of the root cellar, their forms barely distinguishable in the slivers of light cast by a single lantern, are 23 children. They range in age from toddlers, whose wide eyes blink in the unfamiliar light, to adolescents standing on the fragile precipice of adulthood. But it is not their number that freezes the blood in the soldiers' veins. It is their chilling, almost supernatural, uniformity, as if crafted by a single obsessive hand. Every child who turns a fearful face towards the light shares the same haunting. Indelible features, high, sculpted cheekbones, hair the color of burnished copper shot through with threads of gold, and pale, unnervingly green eyes. They are a perfectly matched set of living dolls, a silent, breathing testament to a secret too dark to comprehend. The captain, a man who had witnessed the horrors of Antietam, feels his composure crack. He kneels, the rough wool of his uniform scraping against the dirt floor, his voice emerging as a strained whisper. "It's all right," he says, the words feeling hollow and absurd. "We're here to help." The children shrink back, A collective flinch. Finally, the eldest, a girl of perhaps 13, whose gaze holds the weary sorrow of an old woman, finds her voice. It does not tremble. It is clear, steady, and devoid of emotion, as if reciting a catechism drilled into her since birth. "Mistress says we are her legacy," she announces to the stunned soldier. "We cannot leave. We are her blood." The statement, so simple and yet so profoundly monstrous, hangs in the fetid air. It is a grotesque perversion of kinship, a truth so abhorrent it short-circuits the mind. In that moment, the captain understands that he has stumbled upon a darkness far deeper than the cellar itself. This incident is meticulously documented, but only once, in a carefully composed letter by the officer, who marked it strictly confidential and dispatched it to his superiors. He knew that some truths were a poison, capable of sickening the very soul of the army. The letter was archived. Thornhill Estate was officially deemed abandoned, and the local historians of Burke County, whether through shame or coercion, performed a quiet, collective act of erasure. The plantation, its mistress, and a terrible secret vanished from the annals of the region. A historical amputation, but a thing, once it has happened, can never truly be unhappened. And the nightmare that Catherine Thornhill built, in the 16 years between her husband's last breath and the arrival of those Union soldiers, demanded a reckoning. To understand the genesis of such a diabolical vision, we must return to 1847, to the precise moment when the seeds of this horror were sown in the decaying soil of a dying kingdom. Thornhill Estate was more than a plantation. It was an isolated universe, a sprawling 1,700-acre fiefdom governed by its own laws and its own god. But by the mid-19th century, this universe was contracting, collapsing under its own weight. The rapacious demands of King Cotton had bled the land dry, leaving the once fertile soil anemic and exhausted. The global price of cotton, the engine of the southern economy, was in a slow, inexorable decline, and the grand estates built on its fluffy white wealth were hemorrhaging money. Thornhill was a microcosm of this systemic decay. It was a place of profound geographic and psychological isolation, miles from the nearest town, shielded from the outside world by a labyrinth of dense pine forests and sluggish, reptile-haunted swamps. This seclusion was a double-edged sword. It insulated Thornhill from scrutiny, allowing its internal affairs to fester in private. But it also bred a palpable sense of stagnation, of being a forgotten backwater where time itself had slowed to a crawl. The air was a thick, suffocating blanket of humidity, carrying the sweet, cloying scent of magnolia and the underlying stench of the slave quarters. This was the bedrock upon which Thornhill and the entire antebellum South was constructed, a brutal social hierarchy that granted one race absolute dominion over another. On this plantation, 112 enslaved men, women, and children were not considered human. They were assets, catalogued in account books alongside horses, mules, and bushels of corn. The law, the church, and the culture all conspired to reinforce the divine right of the master to control every facet of his property's existence, their labor, their bodies, their children, their very future. It was a system that, when placed under the extreme duress of economic failure, could warp the human soul into something unrecognizable. As the patriarch of Thornhill, George Thornhill, succumbed to a swift and vicious fever, the absolute power of this decaying kingdom was about to be transferred into the hands of his wife, a woman who would wield it with an audacity that would defy belief. Catherine Danforth Thornhill was not a daughter of the southern elite, born to a respectable but unremarkable merchant family. She harbored a quiet, steely ambition that was at odds with the demure facade she presented to the world. Her marriage to the significantly older and wealthier George Thornhill had been a masterstroke of social climbing, catapulting her into the landed gentry she had long admired from afar. For 2 decades, she flawlessly performed the role of the gracious plantation mistress. Her days were a carefully orchestrated ballet of managing the vast household, overseeing the kitchens, and hosting the occasional lavish party for the county's other prominent families. To the world, she was the epitome of Southern womanhood, pious, elegant, and devoted. But beneath the layers of silk and propriety lay a mind of formidable intelligence and a will of tempered steel. She was a pragmatist, a survivor. Her husband's death was therefore not merely a personal loss. It was an existential threat. She was left a widow, the sole steward of a failing enterprise, and the guardian of a family name she was terrified of seeing reduced to destitution. Alongside her were her 4 biological children, and one lingering link to her husband's past, Richard, his son from a first marriage, now a pensive and keenly observant young man of 18. Richard had always navigated his home with the quiet caution of an outsider. He had loved his father deeply, but maintained a relationship with his stepmother that was built on a foundation of polite, unspoken distance. In the desolate months following his father's funeral, he watched her, expecting to witness a woman undone by grief and the crushing weight of her new responsibilities. Instead, he observed a chilling metamorphosis. The gentle, soft-spoken mistress of Thornhill seemed to evaporate, and in her place stood a cold, calculating strategist. Catherine Enfrin sequestered herself in her late husband's study, a room she had seldom entered before, and was consumed by the plantation's ledgers and the latest agricultural journals. Richard noticed a subtle but profound shift in her language. She no longer spoke of the enslaved workers by their names, but referred to them as assets, breeding stock, or productive units. He saw her making strange, meticulous notes in the margins of the records, charting not just births and deaths, but specific physical attributes, height, strength, even eye color, tracking the lineage of her workers with the dispassionate precision of a livestock breeder developing a new strain of cattle. It was this detached, scientific obsession that first planted a seed of profound unease in Richard's soul. He saw a new, unfamiliar light glinting in his stepmother's green eyes, not the dim embers of sorrow, but the bright, cold fire of a terrifying new resolve. He sensed that she was not merely trying to stave off bankruptcy. She was preparing to launch a revolution, a grand experiment to rebuild her kingdom on entirely new and utterly monstrous foundations. He could not yet conceive of the true nature of her plan, but he felt its shadow lengthening, a dark premonition that the oppressive silence of their isolated world was about to be broken by secrets of the most unspeakable kind. The first tangible tremor of Catherine's grand design manifested not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet, scandalous biological fact that rippled through the very fabric of Thornhill's isolated world. 9 months after her husband was laid to rest in the family crypt, a time when a widow was expected to be a spectre of grief shrouded in black crape, it became apparent to the entire plantation that Catherine was with child. In the rigidly stratified society of the Antebellum South, where a white woman's virtue was her most prized and most scrutinized asset, such a development was a social bombshell. Whispers, venomous and swift, slithered through the slave quarters and rustled behind the silk fans of the county's other matriarchs during their rare visits. Had there been a secret lover hidden in the shadows of her grief? Was the impeccably proper Mistress Thornhill a woman of hidden, insatiable passions? Richard, observing from the periphery of this storm, saw no passion in his stepmother's cool, green eyes. He saw only a chillingly serene sense of purpose. the calm of a chess master executing a long-planned gambit. When she gave birth to a healthy son, whom she named William, she faced the hushed inquiries with a story so audacious it bordered on the blasphemous. She announced to the few who dared to broach the subject that the child was a final, miraculous, posthumous gift from her beloved George, conceived in the fevered haze of his last days. It was a lie so bold, so contrary to the known timeline of her husband's rapid decline and death, that it performed a kind of social alchemy. It did not invite belief, but it commanded silence. The sheer audacity of the claim replaced the community's curiosity with a mixture of awe and a newfound fear of the woman who would dare to utter it. Catherine had effectively built a wall of disbelief around herself, a barrier that would shield the far more terrible truth to come. This act of social defiance, however, was merely the overture. The true, insidious work began when no one from the outside world could see it in the fields and the cabins of the enslaved. Catherine's agricultural journals, once filled with pragmatic notes on crop rotation and soil composition, now contained a new, far more disturbing lexicon. She began a process she referred to in her private, spidery script as rationalizing the breeding stock, with the cold precision of a deity rearranging a constellation, marriages and long-standing pairings among the enslaved community, some of which had endured for decades, were abruptly dissolved by her decree. A strong, respected field hand named Isaac, who had a wife, Sarah, and 2 children, was suddenly ordered to cohabit with Ruth, a younger, stronger woman noted in Catherine's ledger for her sturdy frame and placid disposition. Couples were torn apart with the same dispassionate logic a farmer might use to separate a prize bull from an inferior herd. The ensuing heartbreak. The silent tears shed in the darkness of the cabins. The simmering resentment, these were all noted by Catherine not as evidence of human suffering, but as initial behavioral noncompliance, a temporary inefficiency in her system that needed to be managed and corrected. Then came the shadow of Miriam Grayson, a local midwife with a reputation for being discreet and asking no questions. Her horse-drawn buggy, weather-beaten and unassuming, became a harbinger of dread whenever its wheels creaked up the long, oak-lined drive to Thornhill. Her visits, always conducted under the cloak of twilight, were followed by an unnatural quiet in the quarters. Women who had been with a child, their pregnancies a source of hushed hope, would suddenly reappear in the cotton fields days later, their bodies slighter, their movements heavy with the physical and spiritual exhaustion, their eyes hollowed out by a grief they could not dare to name. Pregnancies deemed unauthorized or genetically undesirable, according to Catherine's secret calculus, were simply erased. The midwife's silence was purchased with a steady flow of coin, but the silence of the community was enforced by the absolute, primordial terror of a mistress who held the power of life and death, not just over them, but over the very possibility of their future generations. These were the first whispers of the unfolding nightmare, the strange, immaculate conception of the mistress, the cold-blooded rearrangement of families as if they were pieces on a board, and the silent, clinical termination of inconvenient, unscripted lives. Richard saw it all, and the dark premonition he had felt began to curdle into a sickening certainty that something profoundly unnatural, an evil that defied all known categories, was taking root at Thornhill. Richard's simmering unease festered into a quiet, desperate, and profoundly lonely investigation. He became a ghost in his own home, a silent observer documenting the slow-motion atrocity unfolding around him. He began to watch, to listen, to piece together a puzzle whose final picture he was terrified to see. He spent his days ostensibly overseeing the plantation's failing operations, But his true work began when the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. He started his own secret journal, a stark counter-narrative to his stepmother's clinical ledgers. Scribbling his observations by candlelight in a locked room, he recorded the forced pairings, noting the dates and the names of the individuals involved. He tracked the midwife's ominous visits, correlating them with the sudden, tragic ends of pregnancies in the quarters. And most disturbingly, he documented the births that resulted from Catherine's calculated unions. As these children grew from infants into toddlers, their features solidifying, a horrifying pattern began to emerge, one that was impossible for his rational mind to ignore or explain away. Despite having different parents, many of them shared subtle but distinct physical characteristics. There was a particular shade of auburn in their hair that caught the Georgia sunlight, a specific high arch to their cheekbones, and, most unnervingly, a recurring tendency towards pale. Unnervingly green eyes, eyes that mirrored his stepmother's with an uncanny fidelity. The pressure inside him mounted with each new observation. A silent scream building in his chest. He felt a growing chasm between himself and the rest of the world. The profound isolation of being the sole witness to an invisible, slow-burning crime. His investigation then took a deeply personal and far more terrifying turn. He began to systematically compare the children born in the slave quarters to his own young half-siblings, the ones Catherine had borne since his father's death. He would watch them from the veranda as they played on the manicured lawns of the main house, his gaze shifting from his brother William's copper-colored hair to the identical shade on a young slave girl named Violet, who was weeding the flower beds nearby. His blood would run cold. He would see his infant half-sister, Eleanor, in her crib, her startling green eyes blinking up at him, and see their perfect echo in the face of Thomas, a young, strong field hand born of one of Catherine's first arranged pairings. The resemblance was no longer a matter of suspicion. It was a stark, undeniable, biological fact that defied all laws of nature and society. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless. This was not merely about creating a more productive, more resilient workforce. The neat, brutal, sacrosanct line that separated the master from the slave, the very foundation upon which their entire world was built, had been perversely and systematically erased at Thornhill. His stepmother had not just manipulated the bloodlines of her enslaved workers. She had interwoven her own into the very fabric of a monstrous experiment. His own siblings, the children of the main house, were not separate from the plan, they were integral to it. They were the primary stock, the genetic wellspring from which this new captive generation was being drawn. The horror was no longer confined to the distant slave quarters. It was in his house, at his dinner table, sleeping in the cribs down the hall. The escalating pressure became a constant, suffocating weight, the knowledge a poison circulating in his veins. He knew he was on the verge of a truth far more monstrous than he could ever have imagined. And he knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had to find the definitive, irrefutable proof. His obsession, now a burning fever in his mind, led him to the one place he had been implicitly forbidden to go, his late father's study. The room had become Catherine's sanctum, her strategic command center, the heart of her dark enterprise. It was the one place on the entire plantation that was always, without exception, kept locked. He had seen her emerge from it at all hours of the night, her face illuminated by the flickering glow of an oil lamp, an expression of intense, fervent concentration etched upon her features. He knew instinctively that whatever core this darkness had, it beat within those four walls, one sweltering August afternoon, when Catherine was called away to a neighboring town on a rare and urgent business matter. Richard seized his chance. The opportunity was a sliver of light in an oppressive darkness, and he moved with a desperate, furtive energy. After ensuring he was alone in the cavernous, silent house, he forced the lock on the heavy oak door, the sharp, metallic click of the tumbling pins echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. The room he entered was not a place of chaos, but of a chilling, almost surgical order. Gone were his father's dusty, leather-bound books on philosophy and classical literature. In their place were shelves lined with modern, practical volumes on animal husbandry, European genetics, and advanced agronomy. The walls, once adorned with family portraits, were now covered with sprawling, meticulously hand-drawn charts. They traced the lineage of every enslaved person on the estate, not as a family tree, but as a breeding schematic, complete with notes on dominant and recessive traits. On a small side table, he found dozens of small, neatly labeled paper packets, each containing a lock of hair physical samples, collected and categorized with scientific detachment. But the centerpiece of this laboratory of human cruelty, sitting on the polished surface of the mahogany desk, was a large, leather-bound journal, secured with a brass lock of its own. With trembling hands and a hammering heart, he broke the lock with a letter opener. The pages within were filled with Catherine's elegant, precise script, but the words formed a cryptic, nightmarish code. He saw entries detailing grafting techniques, hybridization trials, culling the inferior stock, and methods for improving the yield of the primary rootstock. At first, it seemed like the esoteric, if obsessive, notes of a highly dedicated farmer. But then, his eyes fell upon a name he recognized: Isaac, the strong field hand who had been torn from his family. The entry read, "Rootstock B. Isaac, crossed with specimen G. Ruth. Progeny exhibits desired physical strength, but lacks ideal docility. Subsequent generation to be grafted with a more compliant strain to moderate temperament." His blood turned to ice. This wasn't about crops. It was about people. He frantically flipped through the pages, his mind reeling, struggling to process the scale of the cold. Calculated depravity. He saw the names of women he had known his whole life listed as broodmares, their fertility cycles tracked and analyzed. He saw children, some of whom he had watched take their first steps, evaluated and graded like prize cattle at a country fair. And then he found it. The final, soul-shattering truth. He found a chart tucked into the back of the journal, a chart titled "Primary Hybrids, the Thornhill Line," and on it, at the very top, were the names of his own half-siblings, William and Eleanor. Traced back from them, listed as the prime seed-bearer, was a single, elegantly written name: Catherine Danforth Thornhill. The journal was not just a record of a breeding program, it was a confession. It was a monstrous testament to a multi-generational experiment in which his stepmother was both the scientist and the primary genetic subject, using her own children as the foundation for a new, captive human race. A race bound to Thornhill not just by chains, but by blood. The room began to spin, the neatly penned lines of the journal blurring into a screaming indictment of a sin so profound, so fundamentally evil. It had no name. The full, hideous truth of Thornhill had finally been revealed. And in that moment, Richard knew his world and his life had been irrevocably and absolutely shattered. The leather-bound journal in Richard's hands was no longer just a book. It was a testament, an artifact of pure, systematized, and meticulously documented evil. It was the irrefutable evidence that transformed his sickening, nebulous suspicions into a concrete, soul-crushing reality. Each precisely penned page was a window into the cold, dark abyss of his stepmother's mind, a mind that operated with the chilling logic of a mathematician and the moral compass of a plague. The coded language of agriculture was not merely a disguise. It was the very lens through which she viewed the world, a lexicon that allowed her to commit atrocities while maintaining the detached perspective of a scientist. People were not people. They were rootstock, specimens, and yields, love, kinship, and the sacred bonds of family were reduced to bonding behaviors and genetic compatibility. The journal was a masterwork of dehumanization, written with an elegant, steady hand that betrayed no hint of madness or remorse, only a profound and terrifying clarity of purpose. He saw sprawling, intricate charts that cross-referenced physical attributes with work outputs, attempting to isolate the genetic markers for strength, endurance, and, most chillingly, for docility. He read Catherine's meticulous notes on the economic inefficiencies of emotional attachment between mothers and children, and her clinical observations on the optimal age for separating them to minimize productivity loss. Beside these notes were the small, labeled packets of hair he had seen earlier. He now understood their ghastly purpose. They were not keepsakes. They were physical data points, genetic samples in her vast, monstrous archive. He found a lock of Isaac's coarse black hair placed carefully next to a strand of Ruth's softer brown hair, with a note attached in a neat, feminine script. Progeny exhibits desired hybrid vigor. Recommend replication across 3 other female specimens with similar pelvic structure. It was a ledger of human souls, treated as nothing more than a series of biological inputs and outputs. The journal was more than proof of a breeding program. It was a philosophical treatise on a world devoid of God, a world where the only metric of value was utility. And the ultimate arbiter, judge, and creator of that utility was Catherine Thornhill. But the most damning evidence, the proof that elevated her crimes from merely cruel to historically monstrous, lay in the final pristine pages, under a section titled Long-Term Projections, the 100-Year Plan. Here, with the foresight of an empire builder, Catherine had mapped out the future of Thornhill. It was a future built upon generations of her own descendants, both those acknowledged in the main house and those hidden in the slave quarters, all bound by blood and by law to the estate in perpetuity. It was a plan for a perfect, self-sustaining, and inescapable system of slavery, a closed biological loop of incestuous propagation designed to create a workforce that could never legally be emancipated because, by her twisted and brilliant logic, they were all her heirs. Inheriting their bondage as their sole birthright, she had not just broken a societal taboo, she had weaponized it, turning the very concept of family into the bars of a cage. She had engineered a biological prison from which there was no escape. This journal was the ultimate confession, a document so thoroughly and methodically evil that it seemed to hum with a malevolent energy in his hands. Holding it, Richard understood that he was holding the very soul of his stepmother, and it was a perfect, ordered, and calculated void. The confrontation, when it came, was not the storm of shouting accusations and tearful denials he might have anticipated. It was a quiet, suffocatingly tense affair, played out in the oppressive, candle-lit silence of the grand dining room that evening. Richard did not speak a word. Words felt inadequate, obscene in the face of such a truth. He simply walked in, his face a pale, grim mask of judgment, his youth stripped away, leaving only the weary resolve of an old man. He placed the open journal on a polished mahogany table, directly in front of his stepmother's dinner plate. He turned it to the page detailing the primary hybrids, The page where his own half-siblings were listed in their mother's hand as the foundation of this new, captive race. The air grew thick, heavy, and cold. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall hammering against the silence like a countdown to damnation. Catherine did not gasp. Her silver fork and knife did not clatter to the plate. She simply stopped chewing, her jaw freezing mid-motion. She slowly, deliberately, raised her eyes from the damning page to meet Richard's, and in their green depths, he saw no shock, no shame, no fear of discovery. He saw only a flicker of cold, reptilian annoyance, the profound irritation of a master strategist whose meticulous, world-altering plans had been disturbed by a sentimental, insignificant fool. This was her confession. It was not rendered in words, but in that chilling, absolute, and terrifying absence of humanity. Her silence was a scream of guilt, an admission more damning and complete than any spoken sentence. She had built an empire on secrets, and he had dared to read a sacred text in that moment. The final veil was torn away. Richard was no longer looking at his stepmother, the woman who had once read him stories as a child, her voice soft and soothing. He was looking at a monster, a creature who saw her own children not as flesh and blood to be loved, but as instruments to be used, cogs in a grand, generational machine of her own diabolical design. The full hideous scale of her ambition was laid bare to become a god on her own small patch of earth, creating a lineage in her own image, a lineage of perfect, perpetual slaves. She had sacrificed everything and everyone to this singular, monstrous vision, her husband's memory, the lives of the people she owned, and now, the soul of the son who had discovered her. His death was as quiet and clinical as her record-keeping. 2 nights later, as a storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil within him, Richard was seized by a violent, convulsive illness that tore through his body. A local doctor, a man whose family had long been indebted to the Thornhills, was summoned. He dutifully, and perhaps with a degree of willful ignorance, diagnosed it as a sudden, aggressive form of cholera, a common enough killer in the rural South to avoid any unwanted questions. But as Richard lay dying, his body racked with an agony that felt like fire licking at his veins, he knew the truth. In a moment of terrible clarity, he recognized the faint, almond-like scent in the chamomile tea his stepmother had so kindly, so lovingly brought to his bedside herself, insisting he drink it all. It was poison. As his life ebbed away, his vision blurring, Catherine sat by his bed, dabbing his brow with a cool cloth, holding his hand, her face a perfect, tragic mask of maternal grief for the benefit of the house slaves who watched, weeping, from the doorway. It was her final, most perverse act of control to author her son's death and then to narrate it as a natural tragedy, to weep for the murder she was committing. His murder was the ultimate act of confession, the final, bloody signature on her life's work, with him gone. The last witness who understood the full truth was silenced, and her terrible secret was safe once more. For 16 long years, it remained so. Catherine's plan continued uninterrupted, a silent, subterranean horror. Her legacy grew in the darkness of the cellar, a secret population of children who knew no world beyond their prison and the strange, pale woman who was their mother, their mistress, their god, and their creator. But history has a momentum of its own, and the tide of war, a force of cataclysmic change, eventually brought the outside world crashing down on Thornhill's gates. In the spring of 1864, The arrival of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry shattered the plantation's hermetic isolation forever. The discovery of the children in the cellar, as documented in the confidential military dispatch, sent a shockwave of revulsion through the Union command. It was a crime so alien, so fundamentally twisted, that it defied their understanding of the very slave system they had come to destroy. The immediate legal repercussions were, paradoxically, almost non-existent. There was no grand trial in a packed courtroom. There was no public outcry fueled by sensational newspaper headlines. The reason, as noted by the commanding officer in his stark, horrified report, was a pragmatic one born of pure, unadulterated horror. The truth was considered too psychologically toxic for public consumption. In a nation already fractured and brutalized by war, a story like this was seen as a potential powder keg, the officer wrote. To publicize this would not be to serve justice, but to unleash a contagion of vengeance that we cannot control. The Union Army was in the business of winning a war and rebuilding a nation, not prosecuting a horror that seemed to defy all existing legal and moral frameworks. Thus, the decision was made at the highest levels to classify the findings, to bury the Thornhill case in the deepest, most inaccessible archives. Catherine Thornhill, who was found in the main house, seated in her study with the horrific journal open before her, having taken her own life with the same poison she used on Richard, escaped human justice entirely. The societal consequences were a far more insidious affair. The surviving enslaved people of Thornhill were emancipated, but they were freed into a world that had no context for their specific, unimaginable trauma. The 23 children from the cellar, the living, breathing evidence of the crime, were quietly sent to different orphanages in the north, their true origins deliberately obscured to give them a chance at a normal life, but also to effectively erase a chapter of history too painful to confront. And the community of Burke County, from the wealthy planters who might have harbored suspicions to the poor farmers who saw nothing, engaged in a collective, unspoken pact of forgetting. The shame, the horror, and perhaps the latent guilt of their own willful ignorance were too much to bear. Thornhill Estate was sold off, its land divided, its name struck from local maps and histories as if by a surgeon's scalpel. It became a ghost, a whispered legend told only by the brave, its true story intentionally suppressed. The very system that had allowed Catherine's evil to flourish now conspired to erase it, preferring a comfortable, sanitized lie to an unbearable, complex truth. The immediate aftermath was not a cleansing of justice, but a conspiracy of silence. A final, societal layer of earth shoveled onto a crime deemed too terrible to be remembered. The silence that fell over Thornhill was not a peaceful one. It was not the gentle quiet of a place at rest. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a vacuum, the sound of a universe that had collapsed in on itself, leaving behind only echoes and decay. The great house, no longer a home, a laboratory, or even a tomb, but a monument to a dead god and a fallen ideology, began its slow, inexorable surrender to the elements. Paint peeled from the grand columns like sunburned skin, revealing the rotting heartwood beneath. Shutters broke from their rusted hinges to hang askew like broken teeth in silent, perpetual scream. The once manicured gardens, a testament to Catherine's obsessive sense of order, were overrun by the relentless, wild vegetation of Georgia. Kudzu vines, the plant that ate the South, crept over the walls like green tentacles, pulling the bricks apart one by one, as if trying to dismantle the very memory of the place. Nature itself, with its chaotic and impartial logic, seemed to be trying to swallow the evidence, to digest the sight of such profound unnaturalness and pull it back into the anonymity of the earth. The collapse of Thornhill was not just financial or structural, it was a moral implosion, leaving behind a contaminated ruin. A place that locals actively avoided not out of respect for the dead, but out of a primal fear of the evil that had seeped into the very soil. It became a dark spot on their mental maps, haunted not by the specters of wailing ghosts in the traditional sense, but by the sheer, unutterable weight of what had happened there, a truth too heavy for the land itself to bear. For the community of newly emancipated people who had survived Catherine's reign, the redefinition of their lives was an act of quiet, desperate, and unimaginable courage. They did not stay to reclaim the land that had been the site of their torment. The soil itself felt poisoned by memory. And to plant new roots, there would be to risk nurturing the same old horror. Instead, they scattered to the four winds, a diaspora of trauma, seeking not just new homes, but entirely new identities. This was not a simple migration. It was a conscious and painful act of self-erasure, a necessary amputation of their own past. They shed the names that had been assigned to them in Catherine's cold, methodical ledgers as a snake sheds its skin, choosing new names that spoke of hope, of faith, or simply of the freedom to choose. They built new families, this time based on the radical concepts of choice and affection, not on the cold calculus of a breeding program. Every child born of love, every voluntary union, every meal shared in a home they owned, was a silent but powerful act of rebellion against the ghost of their creator. For them, freedom was not just the absence of chains, it was the freedom to forget. It was the grueling, lifelong process of killing their own past, the memories, the trauma, the genetic blueprint they never asked for so they could be reborn. Their survival, their ability to love, to laugh, and to build new lives in the wake of such a deep, systemic trauma, was in itself the most profound and elegant refutation of Catherine's entire philosophy. They proved, in their quiet, resilient defiance, that the human spirit was not a trait to be bred for docility, but an indomitable, unquenchable fire that could outlive even the most monstrous and logical of designs. But what of the living legacy of that design? What became of the 23 children with the auburn hair and the startling green eyes? The ones discovered huddled in the primordial darkness of the cellar, blinking in a world they had never truly seen here. The historical record falls into a frustrating and tragic silence. Official documents, terse and bureaucratic, state only that they were moved north and placed in the care of various orphanages and institutions. Their identities were intentionally separated, their past deliberately and systematically obscured. It was, perhaps, an act of mercy, an attempt to give them a tabula rasa, a blank slate upon which to write a normal life, free from the crushing, incomprehensible weight of their origin story. But it was also the final, devastating act of erasure, a kind of legacy assassination. The first crime was creating them as a biological experiment. The second was erasing them from history. Did they ever learn the truth of their parentage? A truth that was both their origin and their curse. Did they grow up feeling a profound sense of dislocation? A feeling of being a genetic island, wondering why they shared no resemblance to the families who took them in? Did they catch their reflection in a shop window and feel a pang of otherness? A sense of being fundamentally different without a language to describe why did they see their own unique features reflected in the faces of strangers across a crowded room and feel an inexplicable, ghostly sense of connection to a family they never knew they had, a family that was both their kin and their creators? We will never know. Their stories, their struggles, their triumphs or their tragedies are lost to us. casualties of a history deemed too painful to preserve. They were absorbed into the great, anonymous river of American life, carrying within their very DNA the haunting, silent legacy of Thornhill. One can only imagine that genetic echo Catherine's startling green eyes, her high cheekbones reappearing unexpectedly, like a ghost, in generations to come, in grandchildren and great-grandchildren in Chicago, or Boston, or Philadelphia, a strange and beautiful physical trait passed down through the decades, its horrific origin story mercifully, completely unknown. And what of Catherine's other children, the legitimate ones from the main house, who were themselves the primary instruments of her plan? Their fates, too, are shrouded in mystery, as if the shame of their mother's actions rendered the entire family invisible to the historical record. The legacy of Thornhill is therefore not just one of remembered horror, but of a profound and aching absence. A story defined as much by the terrible things we know as by the vital things that have been forever, and perhaps unforgivably, lost. Perhaps the greatest, most enduring secret, then, is not what happened to the children, but why it happened at all. Catherine Thornhill was not a raving lunatic, driven by some chaotic madness that could be easily dismissed. Her journal reveals a mind that was sharp, rational, disciplined, and terrifyingly lucid. She was a product of her time and her class. But she took the underlying evils of that system, the dehumanization of black bodies, the commodification of human life, the obsession with bloodline and inheritance, and pushed them to their absolute, horrifying, logical extreme. She saw a problem, the economic decay of her world, and the threat to her family's status, and she engineered a solution with the same amoral pragmatism she might have used to design a new type of cotton gin or a more efficient crop rotation schedule. Her crime was not one of passion, but of a chilling, methodical rationality in the private theater of her own mind, a theater where she was the sole actor and audience. She had convinced herself that she was not a monster, but a pioneer, a savior, a visionary securing her family's legacy for a century to come. She was the hero of her own twisted, solipsistic story. And in that lies the most enduring and terrifying warning of the Thornhill story. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question: when a system, any system, grants one human being absolute power over another, where is the line? Where does the logic of profit and efficiency end, and the abyss of inhumanity begin? The story of Catherine Thornhill is a testament to the fact that the greatest evils are often not committed by villains who believe they are evil, but by ordinary people who have convinced themselves that their actions are necessary, logical, and even righteous. It is a chilling reminder that the road to hell can be paved not with bad intentions, but with a terrifyingly clear and pragmatic vision, one that is completely, utterly, and fatally devoid of empathy. The moment you begin to see human beings as entries in a ledger, as assets to be managed, or as problems to be solved, you have already taken the first step into the same darkness that consumed Catherine Thornhill. The history of what happened in that isolated corner of Georgia was not an anomaly. It was not a freak occurrence. It was the latent potential of a monstrous system, fully realized in the mind of one brilliant, broken, and terrifyingly ambitious woman. The past is never truly buried. Its secrets have a way of seeping up through the soil, demanding to be heard, and the story of Thornhill, though whispered, though erased, has survived. It has survived as a warning that the capacity for such calculated cruelty lies dormant not in monsters from another world, but within the dark, unexplored corners of human nature itself, waiting only for the right, terrible combination of power, desperation, and a terribly logical idea.